On Zionist Literature. Book by Ghassan Kanafani. Translated by Mahmoud Najib. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Chapter 5. Zionist Literature Marches in Lockstep with Politics. Chapter 6. Jewish Infallibility and the Unworthiness of Other Peoples. Chapter 7. Zionist Rationalizations for the Usurpation of Palestine. Chapter 8. From the Nobel Prize to the 1967 Aggression. Chapter 5. Zionist Literature Marches in Lockstep with Politics. In works like Daniel Deronda and Pinsky's The Eternal Jew, Zionist literature assumed its central mission at the start of the 20th century, propelled by an organized political movement that not only facilitated a set of incentives and protections for it but also provided promotional opportunities without parallel in the history of politically directed art. This literature carried out a twofold mission with matchless determination: on one hand, to mobilize Jews by creating a global environment sympathetic to the Zionist cause, and, on the other, to obliterate all obstacles in the way of this coordinated propaganda campaign. Such well-directed work used every available weapon with precision, including falsification, exaggeration, erasure of facts, and the opportunistic exploitation of history to justify entirely new events that were far removed from the location, thought, and personalities of that history. There is no doubt that Zionist literature's contradictory mission was primed for fatal pitfalls in terms of form and content. In spite of this, the formidable Zionist machine prevented any meaningful exposure of its unethical and systematic practices of deception through art. The devotion of these works of art to their mission, the essence of which is logically fallacious as we will see, inhibited their ability to rid themselves of their propagandistic attributes. This rendered Zionist literature essentially different from other politically directed literature, because it is premised on bending the facts to serve a foregone conclusion, even if such a process requires a distortion of history, outright deception at times, and the omission and evasion of all that may contradict that superimposed set of analyses and hypotheses. There is no doubt that Theodor Herzl was the first to earnestly announce this tendency at the turn of the 20th century, when his novel The Old New Land anticipated his own political Zionism. The novel was, in this way, among the catalysts that turned Herzl from an artist to a political figure. After having expressed his deep regret for abandoning his literary career to work toward establishing the first Zionist Congress, Herzl admitted that the objective of his novel was not artistic but propagandistic. It is entirely logical for that novel, therefore, to end up in the condition we find it in 1962. When a German-language edition was published in exactly the same format as propaganda pamphlets, 220 large pages of heavyweight paper, accompanied by 200 illustrations and diagrams about Israel and Jewish history on glossy paper inserts, interspersed with the novel's text, which tendentiously and tediously highlight immigration trends as well as the development of production, the army, and the legislature, along with colored photographs of Israeli towns. This novel, at bottom, was pure propaganda. In fact, in this novel Herzl did little more than push Daniel Deronda's Mordecai a step further, casting him in the field of action, whereas Eliot's Mordecai was a mere propagandist. Stylistically, Herzl invented a formula that would be followed thereafter, in which Palestine was said to be forlorn, simply waiting for the Jews to return to populate and develop it, without any mention of the people who already lived there. Furthermore, Jews' migration to Palestine was made to seem like a service for the Western mind. Herzl affirms repeatedly that the Jews did not do anything for the Old New Land but simply took to it modern institutions that existed in modern countries at the end of the 19th century. This was perhaps the precise reason that Herzl discussed the role that Israel would play in, backwards, Africa and Asia in a manner that evoked Mordecai's orations. Yet while Daniel Deronda's Mordecai, much like the wondrous tale of Ulroy's Sidonia and Pinsky's hero in The Eternal Jew, was a mere propagandist that discussed an action plan to conquer Palestine and employed slogans with a certain intellectual and political resonance, the hero of the Old New Land went on to implement them. This hero, like his author, became part of a de facto political movement with a coherent intellectual structure and a set of objectives. This difference not only brings about a qualitative change in Mordecai's position, it leads to a more direct clash with the facts. Thus, since the Old New Land, it became necessary for the Zionist literary character to march in lockstep with the Zionist political program, which became increasingly prone to contradiction. Therefore, what Mordecai sidestepped in his orations became imperative to address as an existing reality for Joseph in Arthur Koestler's Thieves in the Night, Ari ben Canaan in Exodus and others. And what Mordecai could achieve through the abuse of language and a set of moral imperatives became something that Ari ben Canaan, Joseph and others would have to address through the distortion, omission and falsification of history. Yet the common ground upon which all of the aforementioned phases stood was the Zionist mixing of religion into nationalism, in order to produce a perverted sense of superiority. It is important to distinguish between two senses of superiority. In this regard, one is connected to a common, natural and legitimate sense of pride, while the other is premised upon contempt for other peoples by placing them in a second tier, in a human hierarchy. This was the same idea that later made it to Hitler's infernal playbook. In Moses and Monotheism, Sigmund Freud was concerned with explaining what he called Jewish superiority, as a sense of pride of sorts. Moses, for Freud, put the Jews as close as possible to God and the truth, based on which Freud explained the Jewish sense of distinction as being animated by a special trust in life, because that sensibility was a part of their religion. Freud then took this idea further in the wake of Moses. We have seen how George Eliot relied on the same theory to conclude that Judaism had a right to nationalism. Herzl, too, wanted his novel to prove that the idea of mixing religion and race under the banner of God's chosen people is one that benefits humanity at large. Yet Freud's justifications are unable to turn the Jewish question into one of nationalism. Freud, at any rate, believed that Moses was not a Jew but an Egyptian pharaonic priest in the court of the hapless Akhenaten. His personal letters, on the other hand, demonstrate that he was not inclined to distinguish between religion and race when it came to the Jews, despite the fatal error involved in such reasoning. All religions make their followers feel that they hold themselves to be specially near to him, and that this is what makes them proud and confident. This absolutely does not mean that these religions should take racist or nationalistic positions. All of the above led, perhaps willfully, to neglecting the distinction between those who identify with Judaism and those who share a common ancestral lineage, or between embracing Judaism and forming a distinct nation. Research has shown that modern Jews have neither national nor covenant continuity with the Jews of biblical Israel, and even if they had, it is very doubtful that Scripture speaks of any return beyond that from Babylon. Zionism had to push this idea further when it confronted two of its common challenges: to consistently justify its opposition to social integration and to explain, in an infinitesimally precise manner, the process of turning Judaism into a state and a nation, at the expense of an already existing nation and, perhaps, another religion. Zionism's political thought tried to adapt its response to these challenges in a manner that serves its propaganda and mobilization campaigns, either by, as usual, ignoring the challenge altogether or by presenting fraudulent answers. It would have been almost impossible for most literary works lacking such precise planning and deliberation to descend to exactly where the political Zionist mind desired. Zionist literary works are rife with inescapable contradictions that have been generated by their very own narratives. Thus, They automatically betray the truth about Zionism that political writings have otherwise managed to obfuscate. The Jewish hero is now confronted with a dilemma. He can no longer confine himself to speaking in abstract and hypothetical terms in historical novels. He must now deal with the reality on the ground, which represents the one true measure. In this light, Zionist thought worked hard to legitimize this literature to such an extent that readers have become unable to tell whether Exodus, for example, has informed Jewish historians or Jewish historians had informed the novel. A perfect example of such deliberate conflation can be found in a 1955 book titled Jews and Arabs: Their Contacts Through the Ages by Shlomo Dov Goitian, a professor of Islamic history and Islamic studies at the Hebrew University. He shows that Arab-Jewish relations were good across history and were not characterized by anti-Semitism, nor any of the persecution complexes that result from it. It also states that Arabs described Jews, in modern times and up to this moment, as Arab Jews. Zionism must therefore justify the central claim behind its conquest of Palestine, namely the principle of responding to anti-Jewish oppression, which represents the essence of contemporary Zionist literary works. Thus, we begin to suddenly witness the birth of Zionist works that are hailed as intellectual, yet whose main purpose is a matter of rationalization rather than research. The book cited above by Goitian serves as a perfect case of how Zionist literary works are fed with these unfounded assumptions. Jews and Arabs truly demonstrates the essence of how race and religion come to be interchanged in the current discourse. The book poses the following important question: if Arabs and Jews belong to the same race, why does the history of the two peoples take two different directions? The answer reveals the implausible and acrobatic theory that undergirds the Zionist cause. The author is methodologically unable to distinguish between the Islamic faith and Arab nationhood, and thus blames Arabs for the behavior of other peoples that adopted the religion, and blames Islam for the behavior of nations that adopted it, especially Arabs. If we look beyond this fatal methodological error, we find that the author commits yet another when attempting to explain the divergence of Arab and Jewish histories. The error is that what he calls the Jewish people did not form a national, geographical, civilizational or cultural unit in order for it to be compared to other peoples. If he insists on drawing such comparisons, he must regard Judaism as a race. This is why Goitian's endeavor to bridge this gap, when comparing the histories of the Arab people and the Jews, must appeal to certain metaphysical Jewish qualities. It is also what drives the author to decide that there is a racial basis for the superiority of the Jews over the Arabs across history, i.e., that there are inherent Jewish characteristics from which Arabs are destined to be deprived. The author believes that the historical precedence of Judaism, in relation to other religions, has resulted in the superiority of the Jewish human being in terms of consciousness and value. In an acrobatic manner, the author claims that Arab Islamic culture is the result of the cultural intercourse between the Arabian Peninsula and the remnants of the kingdoms of the peninsula's south, which benefited from a prior intercourse between the kingdoms of Saba and Solomon. Other such laughable opinions and acrobatics from this book of history will be reflected in future Zionist literature. The author, for example, believes that the difference between Arab and Jewish histories stems from the commercial mentality of the Arabs, which can only understand the logic of supply and demand, whereas the mentality of the Jews is based on principles alone. Such research would have arrived at opposite conclusions if it had started by distinguishing religion from nationhood, a point from which any conscientious research should set out. Had the author done this, he would not have needed to resort to such generalizations that would not be out of place in Alfred Rosenberg's Nazi mind. But Judaism is a religion and Jews do not form a nationality. Islam is a religion and Muslims do not form a nationality, and Arabs are a nation, a part of which embraces Islam. This self-evident formula undermines the premise of the entire research project. But this Zionist writer and others like him were actually treading the same psychological ground which they themselves had paved, and turned into an arena for their activities and ideology, a set of assumptions that cannot withstand the slightest scrutiny. What, then, is the value of an artistic endeavor that deals with the Zionist cause? The difficulty of answering this question is without parallel in the history of the creative arts. The standards of Zionist literature are riven with illegitimate rationalizations, and it remains a mystery how they could have been sanctioned. It is as though the critical standards that apply to Zionist-oriented literature are exceptional, and that this blatant exceptionalism has simply become a norm. There is a novel that cannot be described as anything other than a crude distortion of history, namely Leon Uris's Exodus, which will be discussed at greater length later. Yet it is commonly regarded as a historical novel. Let us turn, for now, to a Zionist authority's discussion of this work, for whom the novel's inconsistencies and contradictions are deemed to be the markers of its success and quality. It seems to me that there has been during the last years only one English Jewish writer who has boldly made this confrontation, rethinking or confronting the position of the Jew today, and that, surprisingly, is Leon Uris in Exodus. Soon after it had made its first impact in the United States, I asked one of the most representative Israelis what he thought of it. He replied that he had forced himself to read it. It was a vulgar book, but it was good for the American Jews. I have often thought about that answer and what it really meant. Did he mean that it was just good propaganda? I don't know now, but clearly Uris achieved something much more. He has written a book which has been more widely read by the present generations of American Jews, and probably also of English Jews, than the Bible, and which is better known to the younger generations than the Bible, and largely accepted by it as the authentic version of how the State of Israel came to be established. Uris put sex, success, and James Bondism into Zionism. He gave the Jewish masses of all income groups the image they had been longing for. He showed them that the new Jew could follow the Gentile pattern and emulate it. He did more, he also confronted the non-Jewish reading public with this image of the new Jew, and, outside England, they liked it. The only problem Uris did not manage to overcome is how to reconcile the facts with his fiction. He left that to others. This will not be easy, but it will not be achieved by critics who point to the literary and historical shortcomings of Exodus, however real these may be. For this is the image of Israel that is fixed now more firmly in the mind of the generations of our day than is that projected by either Herzl, Weizmann, and even Ben-Gurion. A close examination of this quote leads one to an astonishing discovery. If this was written about any other novel, the novel would be regarded as a failure. The points that John Kimchi and others have made about Exodus as positives would, by any measure of critique, obliterate any other novel. In Kimchi's opinion, the value of Exodus lies in the fact that it has become more ubiquitous than the Bible and that it is now regarded as an official report on Israel's establishment. He claims that the novel did not reconcile the facts with fiction and that it put sex, success, and James Bondism into Zionism. This contradiction does not lead to any reservations. On the contrary, Kimchi calls on those who insist on exposing the novel's historical and scientific shortcomings to come to terms with them, all for the sake of maintaining Israel's illusory image in the minds of the readers. This is deception of a peculiar kind. While a prominent Israeli figure regards the book to be vulgar and derivative, he insists that it is great for Jewish Americans. What, then, is the purely artistic measure against which a Zionist work is judged? If everything is justified for the sake of serving a prior conclusion, what is the standard against which the quality of art may be critiqued? And why does Zionist art alone stand as an exception to the established standards of literary criticism? This tendency, above all, is what drives a critic like Mordecai Richler to state that it has become increasingly attractive for the American Jew to become a novelist, and to become controversial and distinctive as well. Committing technical and historical errors can suddenly count as merits, much like what has happened in countless Zionist literary works. All this is due to the contradiction that lies within Zionist ideology itself, and its propagandistic requirement that art must perform directly in the political arena. The Zionist novel is not required, as is the case with other novels around the world, to thoroughly explore the facts. On the contrary, it is required to invent new facts at any cost, and then protect them, oftentimes, by appealing to the guilty conscience of the European critic and his illusory responsibility toward Israel. To that end, the Zionist novel positions itself carefully by disregarding half of the facts and exaggerating the rest. A common phenomenon runs through Zionist literary works. While discussing the War of 1948 in Palestine, the author spends half of their book invoking the Holocaust in Germany during the Second World War, while displaying the same competence in either entirely ignoring the Arab point of view during the very year in which the novel is set, or in distorting it by representing it as laughable and illegitimate. In the Zionist novel, Hitler artfully builds Israel along with the Jews. He is a protagonist who is just as effective as any Zionist one in ruthlessly paving the way for the conquerors of Palestine. The reality that confronts the hero of a given Zionist novel, on the eve of the war in Palestine, requires a series of rationalizations to confront it, along with whatever skills the author may have to superficially distort the details of this reality. The Zionist writer must justify non-integration in the societies from which he came, and simultaneously justify the violent uprooting of Palestine's indigenous inhabitants. Such justifications in art are bound to expose the racist and fascist essence of the Zionist movement. The common cause among Zionist writers gave rise to a shared literary trajectory, based on which an almost identical sequence of events unfolds in almost all of the novels that have been written on the establishment of Israel. The sequence of events is as follows. 1. The hero comes from Europe, in most cases, as a result of apocalyptical persecution. He is fleeing the memories of one or two recent massacres at the hands of Hitler, the effects of which remain in his mind and body. He loses his family and friends along the way, and searches for a quiet place to recover, where dormant national aspirations emerge from the depths of his unconscious to rehabilitate his pride. 2. The hero falls in love with a non-Jewish person. But this person could never be an Arab for reasons that will soon be apparent. Through this relationship, the author provides a full explanation of the Zionist perspective and aspirations, and moderates a dialogue through which the story always puts the narrative of a Jewish torment at the forefront, thereby entirely obscuring the heart of the matter. This results in the non-Jewish character's discovery of personal responsibility for the catastrophe, conversion to Zionism as a redemptive measure for a sin committed elsewhere, and ultimately becoming a proponent of the Zionist cause. 3. The Arabs, being the direct adversary, are represented as individuals without a cause, often as mercenaries who either serve a foreign or, at best, feudal power. This is how the author affirms the Arabs' mental and civilizational backwardness as an incurable disease. If there happens to be an Arab character that the hero likes and respects, it would be one who believes that Judaism is the only solution for the Arabs. Through the events of the novel, the author focuses on the barbarism of the Arabs, and on their sheer lack of connection to the land, which they are said to have ruined over generations. This is often accompanied by the author's attempt at exaggerating the Jewish connection to Palestine. To that end, the Jewish hero is revealed to be an astute scholar of archaeological matters and the myths of the Old Testament. With the above tools, the author commences the events of the novel. But he remains in need of a justification for not integrating into the society from which he came. Thus, an abrupt emphasis on the world's oppression against the Jews constantly repeats itself. The object here is not only to present this oppression and exaggerate it, thanks to the world's incapacity to understand the Jews, it is also to show Jewish solidarity in the face of that oppression. Other peoples are attacked from this premise through contempt and trivialization, much like how Leon Uris's Exodus portrayed Jewish resistance in Poland by scorning the Poles across many pages. 5. In light of the absence of geographical, linguistic, historic and economic ties among the Jews, the Zionist author cannot help but regard religion and race as a single internal factor alongside other external factors, i.e., oppression, Hitler's massacres, that push the Jews toward Palestine. Thus Zionist literary works engage in racist diatribes in various ways, through which the hero attains an absolute sense of competence and becomes mentally, physically, and historically infallible. This character not only meets every challenge, but overcomes it with ease. In other words, the character turns into a caricature that has nothing to do with human experience, nor with the achievement of artistic merit. These 5 points represent the broad parameters of the Zionist novel. Only the literary works of Jews who lived in Palestine before 1948 are not beholden to them for various reasons, chiefly that such writers witnessed the reality as it was, and because they did not orient their writings toward foreign audiences. Exodus encapsulates the above outline, along with countless other works including Thieves in the Night by Arthur Koestler in the mid-1940s, Robert Nathan's A Star in the Wind, Yael Dayan's Dust, Ted Berkman's Cast a Giant Shadow, Joseph Viertel's The Last Temptation and Lester Gorn's The Greater Glory. In short, the Zionist writer is concerned with the following themes in their work: absolute Jewish superiority and the infallible hero. The position vis-a-vis the Arabs, in particular, and other peoples more generally. The character of the Jewish people and how they relate to Israel. Zionist justifications of conquering Palestine, which include emphasizing anti-Jewish oppression in general and Hitler's massacres in particular. Chapter 6. Jewish infallibility and the unworthiness of other peoples. Reuben Wallenrod explains the infallibility and absolute superiority of the Jewish hero by saying that the Jewish writer very often loses his objectivity because of this feeling of complete identification with life about him and his responsibility for it. Therefore, the emotional closeness to the events and characters lends charm to his work, but a certain myopia also results from this intimacy. The opposite is true, in fact, as we will see, when Jewish writers are indeed mentally and physically close to the events of the novel, they tend not to lack objectivity as much as the Zionist writer who writes from a distance. For this reason, we will notice a correlation between the lack of objectivity and the practice of writing from a distance. Leon Uris in Exodus not only suffers from myopia, but also from near-complete mental blindness. Yael Dayan, on the other hand, is relatively more objective because she is closer to the events. What is truly worth noting is Wallenrod's claim that a feeling of absolute unity with one's identity and its responsibilities represents a logical reason for losing one's objectivity. This can only be true under one condition, when that identity and its responsibilities are not objective to begin with. Wallenrod's observation would be completely correct if rephrased in the following terms: the Jewish writer's defense of an unobjective cause can only be achieved through unobjective means. This is exactly what explains the contradictions that befall Jewish writers of fiction. In David Shimoni, born in 1886 and arrived in Palestine in 1909, we will soon encounter a poet who was truly close to the events. In his poem The Grave he discusses a man called Catriel who disliked being described as a pioneer. He protests against the imposed idea that he had carried out a great sacrifice. There is nothing to praise, for the life they left was horrible. He sees Palestine as the only place where the Jewish individual may exist with freedom and dignity. He also protests the aura of heroism that has been imputed to the work of the Jewish youth in Palestine, because this is the only country in the world that provided Jews with an opportunity to live. But such a perspective would not last for long. The infallible Jewish hero will take its place and represent absolute superiority in every sense. Little by little, this character will come to represent a discernible phenomenon in Zionist literature, quite distinct from the crude heroes and villains in tales of the Second World War and cheap novels of the American West. This is not a case that can be described as a myopia, as Wallenrod would have it. It is, rather, a recalcitrant psychological complex that disguises itself in a deep-seated and absolutely racist sense of superiority. At an early point, the Jewish writer Yaakov Rabinowitz, 1875–1949, presented his character Amosai in an eponymous novel in the following way. He is an extraordinary man. Living dangerously, he is equal to all occasions. He goes wherever he is most needed. He follows an inner call when he leaves the organization of the watchman to become an agricultural laborer in a village, and returns again to his duty as a watchman when the need arises. He volunteers for the corrupt, degenerate Turkish army in order to do his duty and to serve as an example to others. During all these wanderings he meets dull, mediocre people, drab, tired, weak and arrogant. In contrast to them, Amosai is shown as the ideal new man, the man of the future. This represents a total abandonment of artistic standards in which the hero passes before the reader like a ghost, in spite of the hundreds of pages dedicated to his adventures. It does not seem to be coincidental for the infallible and superior character to have been born at the turn of the century. As can be noted in the novel The Great Madness by Avigdor Hamiri, born in 1886, where it is claimed that the First World War was the Great Madness. Heroism is forced upon the characters. The Jews do not want war and do not support it, but once a part of it, they are compelled to fight as best they can, and they do. This hero will continue to advance toward his superhuman form, or psychological complex, until we read of a time in which untrained little lawyers, entomologists and milkmen from Berlin were able to force 12 Syrian tanks to flee after firing a few unintended rounds. Jews will never tire of recalling such gallantry. Hence, a realistic appraisal of their deeds makes them feel slighted. Even building a house, for them, is a feat whose greatness cannot be captured in words. This position entails a critical set of ethical and artistic consequences on the role that Zionist literature came to play. It is the point of entry from which the superiority complex became a position of unabashed racism toward other peoples and religions, i.e., the position which Hitler later championed. As regards the Zionist novel, the question of Palestine can be summarized in this sentence: on this land, David slayed Goliath, and today, another David will slay another Goliath. The Jewish character is a prophet of miraculous proportions. More than that, he fancies himself an instrument of God, which doubtlessly renders him nothing more than a clown. Thus, an unending parade of absurdity passes before the eyes of the reader of Zionist literature that is at odds with the most elementary of human character types, not to mention the most basic artistic standards. The reader encounters the conquest of Al-Jia, near Al-Majdal, at the hands of 7 semi-armed Jewish men in a broken military truck they had acquired from a battle with the Arabs, conquering without orders, without losing a single man, and with an ease that astonishes their own commander. And merely 30 Jewish men were able to conquer Acre and defeat its protectors in lightning speed, of whom, God knows how many Arabs there were. This is almost identical to the way that a group of Jewish boys were able to discipline a massive number of Arab invaders, in Safed. 12. As for the villages that extend from Safed to Acre, exactly 43 Jewish boys and girls, were assigned to confront an Arab invasion. In Safed, the writer provides a more precise number. 1,214 Jews were surrounded by 13,400 Arabs, or a single Jewish man per 11.1 Arabs. Yet, the writer proceeds to say that even this number is not entirely accurate because most of the Jews of Safed were religious men who do not fight, and the Arabs were in control of the strategic areas of the town. But this fact, of course, did not undermine the superiority of the Jews and their occupation of Safed with unparalleled ease. In Exodus, the English officer Malcolm says, "I like Jewish soldiers. The Hebrew warrior is the finest, for he fights and lives close to ideals. This land is real to him. He lives with great glories all around him." Your chaps in the Haganah probably constitute the most highly educated and intellectual as well as idealistic body of men under arms in the entire world. And so we find the Jewish character Mundek to be voted the military leader during the Second World War, although he was not yet 19. We find 12-year-old Dov becoming the best forger of documents among the Polish resistance, and single-handedly countering the gunfire of 3 infamous and well-armed villains, knocking one to the floor and compelling the rest to flee. When the Palmach men ran out of ammo, they managed to force the Arabs to flee by firing firecrackers and blaring the sound of explosions through loudspeakers, which they had hung on trees. These are the sort of Arab fighters who would believe that Jews were using atom bombs in their attacks, which would prompt them to surrender while sobbing or fleeing while chanting Hasharoma instead of Hiroshima. David of Exodus would declare that there never existed a people, anywhere, who fight for the sake of freedom in the way that ours did. Another character named David would affirm the pronouncement, "I think that no one in the world is brave anymore, except our own people." And behold the lesson that one draws from a Catholic priest's encounter with a Jewish person. The Catholic puts himself at God's mercy and leaves miracles to the saints. But the Jew takes it upon himself to make them. And he does enact miracles. You can never pay a Jew to be an informer, despite the fact that a person of Jewish descent, like Karl Lueger, played an indirect but important role in the worst massacre of the Jews in history, that which took place under Hitler. Hitler said that it was Lueger who first convinced him of the correctness of the anti-Semitic position. Lueger was Hitler's hero. The world cannot help but surrender before such a hero. Hence we find Major Alan Alastair, Britain's intelligence chief in Cyprus, declare in a novel that, "There is nothing we can do to frighten these Jews, as they are armed and they are not behind barbed wire, in Palestine. They eat little men like you for breakfast." Intellectually, Zionists are very clever people. They can argue a camel into thinking he is a mule. Good Lord. Hours with Chaim Weizmann, and I'm about to join the Zionists myself. This sense of superiority also includes the moral dimension as well, as Jews who bomb Arab cities ensure that they do not entail any destruction or casualties, whereas Arab bombs, astonishingly, only kill children. We encounter boorish Jews aboard a Palestine-bound ship who discover, just at the right moment, the most magnificent sense of morality and fighting spirit, which even surprised them. While a piece by Tchaikovsky is playing, Arab fighter jets bombed Tel Aviv, but none of the members of the audience cared or moved. Hay could have died at any moment, but beauty is rare. Even if they were afraid, there existed what was even more real than fear, a Jewish sense of humor, which never dried across 2,000 years of wandering. And when the Syrian gunners' heavy fire forced the Ein Gev settlement to live underground, schools continued on schedule, the small newspaper never skipped an edition, and the pious did not miss a minute of synagogue. Michener tells us in the source that there is an archaeologist in every Jewish family. If these impeccable people were asked to fight, it would be just a scratch. We've won, naturally. The cowards. They wouldn't even fight, though some were pretty good. The combination of all of these virtues necessitates an astonishing Christian realization. A character called Kitty learned that it is impossible for one to be Christian without being Jewish in spirit. Despite the fact that this character suffered mightily, that suffering takes the following form. Mark, Kitty Fremont has suffered more than one person has the right to suffer. Ari, suffered? I wonder if Kitty Fremont knows the meaning of the word. Mark, Amnu, Ben Canaan, damn you. What makes you think that Jews own a copyright on suffering? Why, oh you see, I like people with human weaknesses. Ari, I never have them during working hours. Given that the infallible Jewish hero was surrounded only by men who knew no human weaknesses at the time of action, he cruises through absolute victories without a moment of hesitation. Artistically, Exodus represents that self-evident truth. There is no confusion in knowing the hero and the scoundrel, no mystery in defining right and wrong. The main problem is that the characters of the novels did not ever go into the world. They withhold expression and are not remarkable personalities. This shows how Zionist literature promotes its cause without any regard for the truth, nor the price that may be incurred by distorting and suppressing it. As a result, one witnesses farcical battles that even Mickey Mouse would not dare replicate. We see in such battles how the passengers of a ship called the Promised Land are able to thwart two fully armed British destroyers, Apex and Dunstan Hull, while migrating to Palestine in secret, using nothing but rocks and water hoses in a confrontation that lasted no more than 5 hours. The writer fails to mention a consequential and significant fact, namely, that Jews themselves were the ones that bombed the ship of migrants, the SS Patria, as it was sailing along the shore, drowning 250 people in order to create a propaganda spectacle that embarrasses Britain and pushes the policy of migration forward. The Zionist novel does not merely exaggerate the facts, it invents them. Kessler's Thieves in the Night admits that after a year of his death by a bullet that pierced his head because he could not keep it down, young Naphtali, who was known for his cowardice, became our hero and local patron saint. Yael Dayan evinces the same absurdity in Envy the Frightened, where she speaks through Gideon, "You little bitch. Go to Udi and build of the land, sick, and have half a dozen heroes around you." Upon listening to Ben Gurion, the observer suddenly finds that this psychological complex is not just a literary invention. Our victory in Sinai was not just the greatest in the history of Israel alone, but the greatest victory in the history of the entire world. Amnon Kapiliok admits the existence of a certain phenomenon as a result of all this. After all we say and do, we look at the Arabs from above and don't take them seriously. We feel superior to them, and it is hard to imagine that this feeling will disappear one day. An Arab from the occupied territories bitterly observed a self-evident conviction in Israel, that the Jews will teach the Arabs how to prosper in their countries. Such an ostentatious sense of absolute superiority and divine infallibility was not without consequences. It established a racist position so clearly that it is hard for a critic to resist the conclusion that the European and American currents that admired Zionist literature, especially Exodus, were objectively and surreptitiously satisfying the needs of a concealed racist position, the most important aspect of which is not Jewish superiority as such but the position it exposes toward other peoples as well, especially the Arabs. It is a position that can only be described as racist. In principle, the Zionist cause could not justify its conquest of Palestine without leaning on the same justifications of all other conquests throughout history, i.e., by citing physical, civilizational, mental and moral superiority, the other facet of which is how the conqueror directs his gaze at the subjects of his conquest. In this regard, the Zionist movement had to accomplish two simultaneous missions through the novel. First, to justify the non-integration of Jews in their European societies, and, second, to justify uprooting an entire people from their land. According to Nahum Goldman, the purpose of the Jewish state was to preserve the Jewish people, which was threatened by the lifting of restrictions and integration. Yet the same Nahum Goldman later called on the Jews of the United States to integrate into U.S. society. The Jewish Observer came to discover that it was only in the Soviet Union and the Arab countries that Jews encountered the issue of dual loyalty. Regardless, Goldman then went on to announce that it was not important to work against the social integration of the Jews, even in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. These blatant contradictions underline the challenges that the Zionist novel had to face. Such political maneuvers had to be reflected in literary works, where the issue is contended with ever more pressingly, and where the racist refusal to socially integrate is made more apparent. In these Zionist works of art, the entire world's peoples are subjected to varying degrees of contempt. The Poles are cowards, the Germans are barbarians, the Turks are corrupt, the Greeks are servile, the Arabs are deserters and traitors, the English are complicit, the Americans are opportunistic, and so on. Perhaps Armitaugh may be a Turk, but he can be trusted. Mandria the Greek would have resented being dismissed like a taxi driver, but he was getting used to taking orders from Ben Canaan. There were very few Poles that ran the risk of harboring a Jew. Others extorted every penny from the Jews and then turned them over to the Germans for a reward. Poland in its entirety could not withstand Hitler's advance for more than 26 days, but Jews, according to this narrative, with 30 people, 10 guns and 6 rifles were able to resist for far longer. And the English did not do much in Palestine besides throwing their weight behind the Arabs and exercising unparalleled oppression against the Jews. The Americans, on the other hand, helped the Jews because they feel that they stand accused and were merely assuaging their guilty conscience. But all of these positions do not compare with what is written about the Arabs. If the reader tries to understand the Zionist writer's position towards Arabs as merely that of direct enemies who must be fought, they will soon realize that the superlative contempt in which they are held cannot be explained as an exigency of battle alone. Far more than that, it is a justification for the uprooting of an entire people, and an absolute unwillingness to find a single square centimeter of common ground upon which dialogue can take place. What does the War of Palestine mean to the Arabs, according to the narrative of Zionist novels? It is, without any doubt, an unnecessary luxury, no more than a question of hiring or bribing impulsive mercenaries. This image derives its tragic nature from the objective it was intended to serve, the migrating Jews from Europe, who have lost their true connection with Palestinian soil as a homeland 2,000 years ago, are represented as the only ones who will fight for it to the death, against the people who have actually been living there for over 2,000 years. The 600 pages of Exodus, for example, lead its author to the following conclusion: if the Arabs of Palestine loved their land, they could not have been forced from it, much less run from it without real cause. The Arabs had little to live for, much less to fight for. This is not the reaction of a man who loves his land. This claim is a mere rationalization. Avoiding reality compels the author to distort it. The Zionist writer is required to justify the uprooting of a people by deciding that Arabs do not deserve a country. If Zionist writers succeeded in avoiding the question of how to transform a country of another people into a national Jewish homeland, prior to the War of Palestine, case in point, Herzl's The Old New Land, contemporary writers must address this point because it is now a reality. But instead of doing so, Zionist writers chose to take a position of essentially declaring that the Arabs are a people that do not deserve to live in the first place. There are no proponents of the theory that allows a civilized people to uproot a backward people besides followers of Nazism. And although this theory has been rejected on a world historical scale, The Zionist novel represents it in an inverted form with the consent of a wide section of Western readership. In spite of this acceptance, the Zionist emphasis on Arab backwardness was pure slander. The Zionist novel was required to justify the behavior of the movement that led to this travesty. It was unfortunate for the Arabs to become the direct enemies of that movement. Its position against the Arabs, in any case, exposes Zionism's true position with regard to other peoples more generally. More on the features of this narrative. Arabs are experts in building on top of the civilizations of other nations. They haven't produced anything worth showing off, except cabarets and filthy postcards, from Tangier to Tehran, not for the last 1,000 years. When involved in battle, Arabs do not have any incentive to win, and if they died for their rulers, for the effendis, or for loot. The Jews who died for a better reason. The Egyptian chief of staff selling secrets to the Germans, Cairo all decked out to welcome Rommel as their liberator, the Iraqis going to the Germans, the Syrians going to the Germans, the Mufti of Jerusalem a Nazi agent. The lives of Arab children seem to be useless, as opposed to the morale of Jewish children. There did not seem to be any kind of fun, songs, games or goals among Arab children. It was an inert existence. A new generation is born along a desert caravan that travels along an unending desert. Arabs cannot aim well with their weapons. They abandon their dead, leaving it to the Jews to bury them. If it is indeed true that they know how to operate tanks, they do so in their jalabiya. While Jews are able to buy the loyalty of any Turk with ease, they know that the only thing that Arabs can understand is a fist. Kessler spends 17 pages describing the customs of an Arab village in an insufferably disparaging and arrogant manner. When he discusses a land sale in another Arab village, he tells us that the elders of each clan had to be bribed separately, and the thumbprints of each of the 563 members obtained, including the babes and village idiots. The author repeats that sentence that often stokes the imagination of Europeans and their mockery. He does not tire from substituting the phrase, "the father decided to marry his son," with, "he decided to buy Isa a good wife, regardless of cost." Uris sings the same seductive tune when the Jewish hero tells Kitty, the American, that an Arab wanted to buy you. "He offered me 6 camels." He goes on, "Before the honorable Jewish fighter, Arab thugs slither, along the ground with knives between their teeth. In other instances, they crawl slowly, followed by the officers of the group, forcing them to carry on crawling by pointing their rifles at their backs." When one of the leaders informed Fawzi al-Kawukji that his men decided to fight until their last drop of blood, the reader must expect that that was not based on a deep or virtuous incentive. Thus, upon listening to these men's speech, al-Kawukji says, "Good. They are costing us almost $1 a month in pay alone." When the Arab was ready to die for $1, it is natural for Arab children to roam the streets to offer the Jews sex with their virgin sisters. When no Jewess would risk living with him, an English officer, and there were no English women available. This left only an Arab woman. In terms of individual bravery, Arabs are even more pathetic. If not fighting behind fortifications of armed concrete, they are totally useless. A walk to Cairo or the Suez is less difficult than cutting butter with a knife. The English officer Malcolm in Exodus provides a rare testimony. If an Arab comes out of his coffee house and takes a pot shot at a kibbutz from 1,000 yards distant, he thinks he is a brave man. The time has come to test these bloody heathens. Therefore, whenever Jews stroll around, they encounter deserted Arab villages, whose inhabitants had been ordered by King Abdullah either to fight, which they had no intention of doing, or to flee, which they did. This is also why they don't play rough, but rather play mean. Likewise, The Jewish character Jossi was able to invade the very heart of a Bedouin tribe's territory, whose men were armed with rifles, and whip their chief in front of everyone, make him beg for mercy and discipline the entire tribe without the slightest resistance. An amusing scene follows. A Jewish audience was queuing before a typhoid vaccination center, among whom there stood a burly Arab in torn clothes and a fez. The Jews would emerge from the vaccination room expressionless, whereas after the Arab entered the clinic, there was the sound of shouting in anger, and then an unearthly shriek, followed by silence. Then, Elsa went in with David, her 7-year-old son. After taking the vaccine, Elsa told Dr. Albert, "I'm afraid he hasn't been very brave, doctor." And Dr. Albert said, "Lot braver than the Arab that was here." Another scene in the same novel features a large number of Arabs who piled up on a single Jewish person in Jerusalem, and tore him to pieces, but were quick to flee as soon as a few Haganah boys arrived. The reader may contrast a confused Jewish girl, who spoke English, German, Danish, French, and Hebrew, and an Arab shopkeeper who only knew how to jabber in Arabic. As if this alone can definitively prove the pointlessness of seeking common ground between Jewish superiority and Arab backwardness, what is even more remarkable is that the floor had not been swept for at least 10 years. If an individual who belongs to a people of such a level were to go to Jordana, a Jewish woman, and tell her of his love, she would spit on him, of course. This wretched man encounters a worse fate when he asks for Jordana's hand from her brother, whereupon the latter's fist shot out and smashed Taha's jaw. The Arab was sent sprawling to his hands and knees, as a response to his outrageous provocation. But these countless examples do not mean that praise for Arabs does not exist. One finds such praise, however, to be much worse than the denigrations. It is only meant to serve the idea of Jewish superiority and their right to the land, i.e., the very premises of the Zionist novel. In Exodus, we find an Arab with whom the author is very sympathetic because he, of course, believes that the Jews are the only salvation for the Arab people. The Jews are the only ones in 1,000 years who have brought light to this part of the world. When the Arab character is allowed to offer his perspective on the ongoing struggle, he would typically say, "The devil may take them, the Jewish settlers, away, but he could leave their tractors. They're dogs and sons of bitches, but they know how to work. They will grow tomatoes and melons and God knows what out of that stony hill. We are too lazy, ya Abu, by God." In The Source, by James Michener, we encounter an Arab called Jamil Tabari, spelled in the book as Ujamail, whose task, in the 1,000 pages that the novel spans, is to defend the Jews and their right to Palestine. The character's value is further emphasized because he is cast as having served as the leader of the Arab resistance in Acre, in 1948. The Arab character explains to his foreign peers that the war was an invasion of Arab desert dwellers who were astonished by Jewish farmlands. This Arab goes further than the relatively modest point of view of the Jewish hero by asserting that the Zionist conquest of Palestine was earned through Jewish superiority and that Arabs are the most destructive people to farming, as they leave a wilderness behind them wherever they go. And when an Arab expresses his patriotism, it comes in the form of pleading with the Jewish character to make him feel like he belongs in Israeli society. Such patriotism is also expressed by announcing that the Arabs should resort to the English sporting spirit of accepting defeat because, if we do that, we might pick up where the Greeks left us 2,000 years ago. This is the same kind of Arab who induces the Jewish character to disavow the idea that Arabs fought the Crusaders, by denying that it ever happened. He also provides him with false and demeaning ideas about Islam. Where the Zionist author does not practically aspire to more than praise for the Jews and denigration for the Arabs, which the author plants into the mouth of an Arab character, the testimony comes from another ally of the Arabs and in some cases, the English. As the English character John Halliwell put it. That chap Mustafa over in Catamon. He fellow who owns all of these houses there. You know him. Devilish nice chap. Never a word said against the Hebrew. Just polite and nice as could be. I had dinner at his place last week. Right on the floor. Absolutely charming. This feudal landlord, who does not yet know what a table is, represents the abandonment of the most important question of the hour. He did not utter a word about the Jews at a time when the country was ablaze with war. The most amusing example in the source, however, is when Mr. Brooke and his wife, two elderly American photographers at the holy sites, criticize Israel in the following manner. You go to a historic spot like Tiberias, hoping to find something that will evoke for people in Iowa the romantic quality of the place, and what do you find? Housing developments, bus stations, a tourist hotel, and on the very edge of that sacred lake, what? A kibbutz. I remember when we first came here, it looked just as it might have in Bible times. But today, you can hardly take a photograph anywhere that tells an audience clearly that you're in the Holy Land. Now it's all towns and building developments. Whereas, in Jordan today you can still find hundreds of scenes with people in biblical costume, little donkeys, heavenly-faced children playing by open wells. With such criticism of Israel and praise for the Arabs, the author seeks to protect his artistic integrity in the most comical manner while preserving the propagandistic message, to the greatest possible extent. As for the moment when arguments rage between conflicting points of view, the Arab takes it upon himself to provide Zionist rationalizations in a spectacular display. The Jew would say to the Arab, "This hill did not produce anything since our ancestors left it. You've neglected it and let its slopes fall apart. We will clean that hill of rocks and will bring tractors and fertilized soil." The Arab responds, "What the valley bears is enough for us. Where God put stones, man should not carry them away. We shall live as our fathers lived, and we do not want your money and your tractors and your fertilizers." This is an open admission from the mouth of the Arab about the reality of the Arabs' destructive role and their insistence on backwardness, in an astonishing manner. We observe another Arab who delivers a lecture on the virtues of the Jewish conquest of Palestine while under the captivity of Jewish soldiers. He expresses, at the same time, his tragic backwardness when he tells an unprompted story about people who touch the screen with their hands while viewing a cinematic film. Such disparity provoked the fury of an American journalist in A Star in the Wind, when he explodes in the face of an Arab who had insisted the land was his. Here never was a house here. There was a desert and a stinking swamp and pox-ridden fellaheen. Your population was on the decrease for centuries because half your babies were dying from filth in their cradles, and since the Jews came it doubled. They haven't robbed you of an inch of your land, but they have robbed you of your malaria, and your trachoma and your septic childbeds and your poverty. Zionist novelists adore this tune and repeat it to a revolting degree. A foreign observer in A Star in the Wind discusses the meanness of the Arabs as a self-evident truth, after these young Israelis, these Sabras, had lived with them, had helped them with their crops and fields, had ministered to their health. When an Arab man expresses his point of view while clashing with Jews, he admits his extreme backwardness and refuses any assistance toward progress. Even palm trees, that primitive and ubiquitous plant that fills the remotest deserts, supposedly did not arrive in Palestine until the Jewish Yarkoni smuggled 100 grafts from Iraq. All of this amounts to what is historically and objectively the most vicious defamation campaign that has ever been perpetrated by a propaganda apparatus. The Jewish writer Joshua Barzillai seems far removed from this narrative when he wrote the following. Upon his arrival in Palestine at the end of the 19th century, "I cannot describe the trees. How can I describe the beauty of the palm trees, the olives, the figs? I, If heaven resembles this, it must be very beautiful. This, of course, preceded Yarkoni's smuggled palm tree grafts to Palestine by about a quarter of a century, when the total number of Jews in Palestine did not exceed 8,000. More importantly, these words were said before Zionist propaganda took it upon itself to represent Palestinian land as an arid desert, and over half a century before the Irishman O'Connor said, "I hear they've made the desert bloom like the rose." That should be a beautiful thing. It is unclear if this Garden of Eden of which the Irishman had heard from a distance was the same garden of the fifth heaven, where Jewish children would plant tree branches in the morning to trick tourists into making donations to turn the desert into a paradise, a scheme inspired and arranged by their nanny under the slogan, "Life is a struggle, a trick in return for a treat." Nor do we know if this paradise is the Zodman forest of the Jewish American, who donated money to Israel to plant a forest named after him, only for the Israelis to place a placard with his name at an old forest to trick him into donating more. All of the above puts the Jewish individual in the position of playing a civilizing role that must be carried out in spite of the opposition of the population in question. He thus becomes transformed from an invader to a reformer, from an outcast to a virtuous father figure. We hear him speak with bitterness about scenes that he could not forget. "I can't seem to forget the Arab slave markets in Saudi Arabia and the first time I was invited to watch a man have his hands amputated as punishment for stealing." It is because he cannot forget that his aggression takes on the grandeur of a reform movement. Chapter 7. Zionist Rationalizations for the Usurpation of Palestine. Arnold Toynbee once said that, "I can understand the Jewish demand, after all of their suffering they have endured at the hands of the Germans, is to be given authority in a certain place in the world to exercise their own sovereignty. If this must happen, this authority would have to come at the expense of the West, which carried out the cruelest horrors against the Jews, and not against the Arabs." This point seems easy and correct to me, but when I once mentioned it in a Western country, which wasn't Germany or England, it was met with cries of laughter. It seems that Zionist propaganda has succeeded in entrenching, in the mind of the Western reader, an idea at odds with the simple and humane formula that Toynbee proposed so clearly. This entrenchment is especially reflected in the Zionist novel. One of the justifications for conquering Palestine essentially rests upon the premise that it is a response to Hitler's massacres against the Jews especially, and against the oppression from which the Jews have suffered in general. It is thus nearly impossible for one to find Palestine treated in a Zionist novel without a reference to Hitler's massacres. It seems that the Zionist author is entirely aware of the value of this blackmailing tool against the minds of his Western readers. This is how he guarantees their sympathies from the first few pages, regardless of any errors that he may commit. Yet, the key point, as articulated by Toynbee, is never addressed. What do the Arabs of Palestine have to do with paying the price of the West's massacres against the Jews, especially given that Jews lived in Arab societies peaceably almost constantly throughout the ages? Though self-evident, this question remains unaddressed, and all of the attempts of the Zionist novel to contain it fall into fatal, and sometimes comical, contradictions. It seems that this is the question with which Leon Uris was preoccupied when he admitted that Arab massacres of Jews were never the calculated genocide of Europe. The Arabs had become too busy plotting against each other to be much concerned with the Jews. In the source, Michener also justifies the absence of Turkish massacres against the Jews by claiming that the Turk did not favor the Jew because he preferred him to the Christian. On the contrary, the Turk, like God, found the Jews to be a stiff-necked people, most difficult to manage. Before the problem of Islam's non-oppression of the Jews in Medina upon the Hijra, Michener elects to say that 799 Jews rejected Muhammad, but it was impossible to execute them all. They were good farmers and they were needed on the land, so a grudging truce was arranged. This crude contortion of the truth leads Uris to dedicate 40 pages of his novel to provide a detailed and dramatic presentation of Hitler's massacres through the words of a child. This is the grotesque opening through which the author justifies the crimes that the Jews have committed 10 years later, and 10,000 miles away against a people who have nothing to do with Hitler's Germany. This is precisely what Michener does in The Source as well. In another novel, we encounter a greater horror. The Jewish character Pat, for example, who is distressed by the death of his lover Sarah, destroys 2 Arab tanks and sets them on fire. He was tired, but he felt that his body was light in an unbelievable way. He turned toward the 2 tanks and said, "This is for you, Sarah, for you." Sarah died in a forced labor camp in Hitler's Germany. For his part, the distressed lover recounts his tragedy 10 years later and 10,000 miles away from the camp in which she died, while attacking Arabs, not Germans. The author finds this to be entirely logical. Then we listen to an American colonel who volunteered to fight alongside the Jews against the Arabs say, "Without ever having heard of Herzl, I was at Dachau. The bodies were still piled up like cordwood. After that, I didn't need any more lessons in the importance of a Jewish homeland." It is an astonishing, uneven, and illogical equation. Why does all this happen? Because every time the Palmach shells an English warehouse, or sends some Arabs to hell, I earn more respect. Why, oh you, here, are fighting my battle to earn respect. It is a very complicated matter, the essence of which is rationalization, not explanation, to fabricate a reason because none exists in the first place. Likewise, the character of Joseph in Thieves in the Night becomes a terrorist in Palestine because Dinah was killed in Germany. In Exodus, we find a ludicrous association disguised as an attempt to address the insoluble problem. Ours not to reason why. I can't seem to forget the Arab slave markets in Saudi Arabia and the first time I was invited to watch a man have his hands amputated as punishment for stealing, and somehow I can't forget those Jews at Bergen-Belsen. The phrase, "not to reason why," represents the heart of the matter. What is the reason, then? It might be that Karen, like all Jews, should go to Palestine. It was the only place a Jew could live with dignity. But this opinion is only half of it. What about the indigenous population? An astonishing response: have the British more right to be in Palestine than the survivors of Hitler? We magically return, via a bridge of fabrications, to the same Hitlerian whip, without arriving at an actual answer. Arthur Koestler obscures the crux of the issue when he attempts to provide an answer through an American journalist. After Kamel Effendi had insisted that Palestine is his home, the American says, "Ah, chuck that talk about your house. For the last 500 years it wasn't yours but the Turks'." Koestler should be the first to know that the Turks' conquest of Palestine does not erase the rights of its original inhabitants. Feigning ignorance of this fact, however, leads Koestler further. He justifies Zionist violence when explaining Simeon's sympathies with the Irgun terrorist gang after he had discovered the British intended to stop Jewish immigration. But Koestler himself declared that, despite being Jewish, "I feel fully English when I'm abroad." He wrote his novel to justify violence and migration. The question is, how is he allowed to reconcile his Englishness with his Jewish identity while demanding that Kamal Effendi cease to identify as Palestinian as a result of Ottoman colonialism? Matters get so thoroughly obscured here, the reality of which the author has no desire to confront. His justifications multiply in a vast expanse of contradictions and fabrications instead. In a conversation on violence between a Catholic priest and the Jewish Dr. Dreyfus, the latter tells the former that the Catholics resorted to violence during the Crusades, to which the priest says, "Oh, but the Crusaders came to liberate Jerusalem." Dreyfus responds, and that's also our goal, as Jerusalem is also a sacred city to us. This response ignores the fact that the city is also sacred for other religions as well. We encounter yet another omission when Ben Kronstein says, 2,000 years I waited for this. The Jews will have a country. This was the meaning of the vote. The Jews will have a country, without British soldiers, without a landlord, they were to have a country of their own. His notion of waiting for 2,000 years omits the fact that there exists an indigenous population in this land that has been endowed to the Jews. This becomes ludicrous when juxtaposed with Kessler's claims that Palestine belonged to the Turks because they colonized it for 500 years, when it supposedly also belongs to the Jews 2,000 years after they left it. But the fabricated justifications for conquest do not end there. Another amusing display can be found in a novel set on the Egyptian-Israeli front. The Jewish character says, Jews against Egyptians. This is a historical matter in Tarahic form. Enslaved Jews built the pyramids under the whip of the Egyptians, and Moses fled with his people to the Promised Land. In today's terms, Moses pushes the Egyptians toward the Suez Canal. After 3,000 years of history, can the Egyptians pick up the whip once more? This alone, at the very least, reveals the obstinance of Zionist novelists, which incurs a dear price as they go to great lengths to construct a spurious narrative around the Palestine War, by placing it in a fabricated history that spans 5,000 years of supposed pharaonic enslavement, before expressing fear of the recurrence of that fabricated horror. This is why the author of A Star in the Wind recounts all of those who featured in the history of Palestine without mentioning the Arabs, and then when they are mentioned here or there, the purpose is to employ them for another justification. Uris summed it up when he wrote, Israel today stands as the greatest single instrument for bringing the Arab people out of the Dark Ages. Arabs reject such benevolence because the priests told them to hate you, and because they believe the priests and are illiterate and live in the 13th century, and haven't read your Marx. Elsewhere, it is claimed that there is a minority of Arab intelligentsia that fights all that is theoretical. As for the majority of Palestinian Arabs, and the rest of the Arabs, they fight without any faith for a land that they know belongs to the Jews. As for the Jews, they had carved a green and living homeland out of fetid swamp and bleak desert. The vicious cycle keeps spinning its frauds without addressing the real issue, namely, that this is revenge against the West and Hitler's sins at the expense of the Arabs, while claiming to save them. It represents absolution of the Nazi criminals with Arab blood. The vicious cycle provides Zionist propaganda with the justifications for violence, aggression and seizure of land, which can only please those who search for romance in legendary epics. All this would lead to the most grotesque process of indoctrination not only on a global scale but also among Jewish circles, where this idea would be cultivated and truly believed and where the racist spirit would be nurtured. In the spring of 1967, an experimental exhibition took place in Israeli towns before a carefully selected audience. A 17-minute tape called Ahmad was played, which was described as a documentary about the life of the Arab youth in occupied Palestine. This tape was in fact nothing more than an ingenious call for the Arabs of the occupied territories to emigrate out of Israel. Its hero stood at the end of it to say, "The best I can do now is to go somewhere, to Canada or America. The important thing is not to be here and look at their women. They fear me, they hate me. I never knew how an ostracized person felt." The clip clearly urged Arabs to regard their departure from Palestine as the only thing that they ought to do. Playing the clip to a test audience yielded astonishing results. The authorities registered the audience's reaction as follows. A blonde girl cried, "Go to Damascus." To the applause of the audience, another exclaimed, "Find me, in any Arab country, a young Arab man whose conditions are better than Ahmad's." And an old man with a Russian accent said, "When I came here, was my condition any worse than his?" Another man asked, "Why don't you mention the positive side? Didn't we bring electricity to the Arab villages?" When one of the organizers attempted to calm the angry audience, during a scene in which a Jewish woman called Mrs. Rabinosovich refuses to rent a room to an Arab unless he registers his name as Abraham Mizrahi, a man shouted, "Take them to your home so they can sleep there, if you love them so much." Ultimately, it was not possible to play the rest of the clip. The audience's response was definitely rooted in the narrative of Zionist novels, as it ignored the heart of the matter by discussing the trials of the Jews and their illusory civilizing role. And despite the superficial disagreement between the clip and the audience, the consensus was that Arabs must leave their land. This was and remains to be the undeclared, yet most impactful, intention of the Zionist movement. We encounter Jewish writers who lived in Palestine prior to 1948, who participated in the war of aggression and have offered, in recent years, short stories and some novels that are more objective than those who wrote from afar. Uris, for instance, who was further from the events than Yael Dayan, and thus more lacking in objectivity, is more prone to exaggerations and is more committed to the premise of Zionist propaganda and its contradictions. Dayan's proximity to the events is what made Envy the Frightened try to justify its infallible hero. The title is appropriate in this regard, as it indicates the author's awareness of the fatal pitfall of Israeli literature. And it is what made Dayan depict human beings, in her third novel Dust, that do not fit the theoretical perversions of Zionism. We will also find other writers who took steps that are more objective than Dayan. Why? The probable answer is that such writers, and especially Benjamin Tammuz, are practically unable to blame Arabs for the crimes of Hitler, as Uris did. They do not feel the need to offer a justification for migration, on a personal level, because they had already been living in Palestine prior to 1948, during which they engaged with the Arabs in various ways, be it through violent confrontations or social relations. Such engagement is, doubtless, what made them experience the question of Palestine in a manner that is more faithful to the realities on the ground, without having to follow the nagging requirements of propaganda, which are normally oriented toward foreign audiences. These conditions drove such writers toward adhering to a bare minimum level of objectivity, which is more than can be said about the giants of Zionist literature. Yet, lest we get carried away by our imaginations, it must be stated right away that the difference between these two groups of writers is rather limited. It seems that the biggest problem that confronts such literary works is that their authors, unlike Uris, cannot deny their personal experiences as a minority in a hospitable refuge, prior to 1948. The problem, in short, is that such a writer cannot make 1948 into a definitive cutoff point in the flow of history. The story for them does not begin, nor end, in 1948. Dayan represents the first instance of that idiosyncratic current in Zionist literature. In her novel Envy the Frightened, she criticizes the logic of who is strong. In doing so, she tackles a fundamental value of Israeli society, thereby expressing the deep-rooted crisis in which it lives and indirectly exposing the fabricated character of the infallible hero, that sick and insufferable character, so readily imported into Zionist literature as though it were an intractable psychological complex. Yet, these novels' justifications for Zionist violence as an inheritance from previous generations remain superficial. You're afraid of people who knew your old self, and you are not so sure about your new self, so you pour it into Nimrod. This contradiction would lead to a pertinent revelation. If the war hadn't been in the air, it would have been necessary to invent it. Ivri's generation had fought the land and conquered it. They took the first step in the change. Gideon's generation fought a world war. Both injected their spirit and strength into Nimrod's generation on a national scale. Thus, Nimrod the Jewish hero expresses his psychological complex to such an extent that justifies murder as an act of innocent love. Then a moment comes when Nimrod stands on a mountain peak near the borders. Who is strong? I shout. You know where the echoes come from this time? From Jordan and the Litani below, from the road to Damascus on the north, and from the low ceiling of the sky. This is a new Jewish hero, who is not only infallible, but whose cycle of violence is unending. It represents an expansionist and escalationist complex that has resulted, as Dayan would have it, from the complexes of previous Jewish generations. It's not so easy to leave it all behind and call yourself new. It takes a slow process, and we are all dead because we hurry to swallow before chewing, so we strangle ourselves. This hero's mission, to us, in any case, is to expose the giants of infallibility in traditional Zionist literature. But it remains too feeble a gesture to reach the heart of the matter. In Dust, Dayan produced a novel that is artistically superior to her previous two. But she was still keen on avoiding the heart of the matter. The events of the novel take place in Al-Nakab Desert, where in a recently constructed settlement its main character Yardina meets David, the only survivor of a family that had died in Hitler's massacres. David is a man without feelings or expressions, haunted by the ghosts of the family he had lost. He represents a character who has been deprived of their humanity. 3. A third character, Lenny, is a mysterious character that lives in the desert. He is lonesome, with a hobby of collecting, naming, and virtually worshipping rocks, who eventually admits to his lover that he is not Jewish. Yardina falls in love with David because she wants him to return to the land of the living. But gradually she feels, instead of growing a flower there, he uprooted her flower from her depths, and his ghosts came to haunt her. And then, as David recovers, Yardina retreats to the world that David had built for her and finally commits suicide. But David feels no guilt because his conscience had already died of another great sin, of which the solitary Lenny was a reminder. Long ago David was lined up in front of Nazi officers who began to send people away, one to death, and the other to prison. David counted the individuals in front of him and realized when his turn came that death would be his fate. So he switched places with the person ahead of him, a tall blonde boy, who was not Jewish but a Pole, and whose eyes reminded him of Lenny's. The confession of this sin was followed by another from Yardina, who was 13 when the establishment of Israel was declared. And I didn't know until then that these towns, these hills, these lakes and beaches and shores were not really ours, that they were promised but never given, dreamt about but not obtained, and when the state was proclaimed, they told me it meant war. Dayan approximated the heart of the matter, if indirectly, that the Nazi Holocaust was not a catastrophe for the Jews only. In this sense, Lenny should have been cast as one of the Arabs that new Israeli settlements had forced to leave. This would be closer to the logic of the narrative, but Dayan did not seem to dare to go that far and chose, rather, to cast a Polish character, or whomever else in that desert who was not truly Jewish, to avoid casting a character that would confront David. On the other hand, it seems that, for Dayan, this inhuman character, who has been hollowed out under the pressures of the Holocaust, is beyond rehabilitation. Thus, instead of rehabilitating himself in the national homeland, the character corrupts the rest and robs them of their humanity, to a degree that pushes them toward death. This is a development on Nimrod's condition in Envy the Frightened, who resorts to violence under external pressures. Neither of these characters were able to restore their humanity. Nor could they face an Arab character, who would represent the indigenous population whose land has been turned into a field of colonial experimentation, in response to Nazi violence. Benjamin Tammuz took a step further in A Tale of an Olive Tree and the Swimming Race. In the former, The author tells the story of an Arab called Ali Altawil who owns a big old olive tree in the middle of his field in Galilee. The tree produces as much as the rest of the field together. Its oil is rubbed on the bodies of newly born infants. Men drink it in the morning. It decorates the dinner table. It is gifted to friends and cures diseases. When Ali Altawil wanted to marry his daughter to an old man against her will, the young woman refused this oppressive arrangement. The father tied her to one of his prized olive trunks for 2 nights, leaving her too afraid and tired to refuse the marriage. Later, she was unable to give birth to her first child in the village because the Jews forced her family to move to the north. The first Jewish immigrant that receives Ali Altawil's farm does not know anything about olive oil. He spits it when he tastes it, and because he cannot kill the tree, he cuts its branches to sell them to handicraftsmen who sell wooden souvenirs to tourists. The tree then starts to extend its branches toward the north, as if, according to the author's narrative, to call to the girl that it once knew and to wait for her from behind the border. Finally, government specialists arrive to cut down the tree. The author writes at the end of the story, "They carefully examined the olive grove's rentability, they said what they said, and a week later, workers came to prepare the land. The first thing they did was to uproot 7 ancient olive trees, first, because they had not been planted in rows and so disturbed plowing, and second, because they were too tall and during picking they required ladders so high that they could not be found in the warehouse of the building contractor, and third, because this is what the agronomist demanded, having found them unrentable." The author uses Zionist literature's traditional manner of describing the traditions of the village in a prejudiced, conceited, and unrealistic manner. But the main point of the story is to tell Ali Altawil's tale through his relationship with the olive tree, that ancient Palestinian heritage, and the new relationship between the settlers and that heritage. These intersecting relationships are consummated by the felling of the tree, which symbolizes another thing that the author fails to mention, that it stands for an unwanted memory. In the swimming race, the author tells the story of 2 friends, an Arab and a Jew, before 1948. They used to race each other while swimming in a river near Jaffa. The Arab would always win the race in those days because he was bigger and older. Then the war broke out, and during an armed confrontation in an orange grove near Jaffa, the Jewish character, now a military leader, is surprised to find his old friend as the leader of the opposing Arab force. The latter addressed the former, as if continuing a recent conversation, "Okay, you win this time." But the Jewish leader responded, "No, you can't say that until we leave the water." The Arab smiled with sorrow. The 2 old friends undressed and, just as the Jewish man enters the river, a gunshot is heard. He suddenly fears that his friend was killed. He gets out of the water and finds the Arab lying facing down on the sand. One of his soldiers tells him that he was killed by accident. Then, when the Jewish man turns the Arab's body around, he finds a mysterious smile lingering on the latter's lips, as if he was the one who won the race after all. These 2 stories by Tammuz reflect a feeling of that thing that the Zionist novel does everything to avoid. For Jewish writers who were close to the events, 1948 cannot be a stone wall that separates what came before it from what came after. It is a link in a sequence, with precedents and antecedents. While many reasons may account for why Tammuz was able to face this reality, he could not take it further than halfway there, thereby avoiding the most difficult steps. He saws down the olive tree and kills the Arab by mistake, before the race even begins. As truncated as these stories seem, they at least do not give the impression that Israel is the bridge between darkness and light. The latter claim cannot be made in a work of art, except by those who don the official uniform of the propagandist. Despite the reservations and pitfalls involved, Tammuz represents a rare phenomenon in contemporary Israeli literature. There is a story titled The Prisoner by a writer called S. Yizhar, which takes a middle position between Dayan and Tammuz. This represents an attempt to depict the tales of superhuman Jewish exploits in a level-headed manner. Thus, he tells the story of how a group of armed Jews arrested an unarmed Arab shepherd and stole his cattle. The story features a detailed description of the abuse that the shepherd experienced in the Jewish interrogation room. The latter half of the story comprises a soliloquy by the Jewish soldier who was tasked with transporting the chained and blindfolded prisoner across a long distance by car. He tries to convince himself to let the innocent prisoner return to his wife, but despite the fact that the logic of releasing the prisoner theoretically wins the long argument, the Jewish soldier does not dare release the prisoner and eventually drives him to prison. Once again, we witness that the narrative has been arrested in order to keep it from the decisive confrontation. The Arab is still carefully chosen to fit a predefined Zionist mold. He represents an innocent fool, and innocence here is an enormous burden under the conditions of war, to which he remains entirely oblivious. He is, in other words, not a confrontational Arab. The space in which the Zionist author can operate is minuscule and superficial, tightly confined to the idea of the acceptable and justified war. The demure protestations are likewise confined to secondary details and not the heart of the matter. Such protestations can be found elsewhere, evincing a similar position in a number of Jewish stories, most notably in Yehuda Amachai's Battle for the Hill. A story that revolves, in a concealed sarcastic tone, around the mobilization of the Jews of occupied Jerusalem on the eve of the Suez aggression in 1956. Another story called A Goat on the Border by Moshe Shamir deals, also sarcastically, with an Israeli goat that crossed the demilitarized zone. None of these stories manage to get past the point where truth demands a greater commitment than propagandistic responsibilities and the exigencies of Israeli politics. All of them afford only the slightest space for maneuver on the level of particulars, i.e., within the confines of a case that has been built entirely upon falsehoods. Within this space, the only literature that can bravely shoulder the necessary confrontation, in form and content, is the literature of the Arab youth who suffer under the military Zionist occupation. The phenomenon in Zionist literature described above is useful in one respect, at least, it exposes it. Here, Yizhar, Dayan, Tammuz, and Shamir contrast their heroes against those of Urus, Nathan, Viertel, Gorn, Berkman, and others, and the difference reveals the extent of the artistic and moral retrogression that Zionist writers practice with unparalleled obstinance. Such retrogression extends beyond the two poles of the above comparison, which runs across two sides that, in spite of superficial differences, ultimately agree in principle. Chapter 8. From the Nobel Prize to the 1967 aggression. At the end of 1966, the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to an Israeli writer for the first time, Shmuel Yosef Agnon. The committee declared that his writing represents the Israeli message to our time. It works hard to present the cultural heritage of the Jewish people through the written word. The committee then showed special appreciation for Agnon for his profoundly characteristic narrative art with motifs from the life of the Jewish people. Only 7 months separate these words from the aggression of June 5, 1967. If the Nobel Committee found in Agnon's chauvinistic, racist and reactionary writings an apt representation of Israel's message, most Western media outlets found a similar message in the Israeli aggression as well. These two events crown many long years of deception, indoctrination and promotion of racist thought and literature. It is the natural and logical outgrowth of an edifice that was founded on the sanctioning and justification of aggression, based on so-called racial and ethnic superiority. That these two events occurred within a short interval is not a coincidence. They are a natural outcome of what we have witnessed in the previous pages. deception and chauvinism have now reached their climax on the cultural and political planes, which have always been deliberately and strategically fused. It is not a coincidence to read after the aggression of 1967, for example, an article in Time magazine, published on July 14, 1967, that repeats the Zionist depictions of Arabs in the crudest and most misleading manner, and passes them off as obvious assumptions beyond discussion. Nor is it a coincidence to read an article by the English political writer Peregrine Worsthorne, in which he called on crushing the peoples of the developing Third World, and putting them under the authority of the economically advanced countries, because they amount to a hopeless case, and because the superiority of the advanced countries grants them the right to dominate the resources of the developing world. Such opinions are expressed in Zionist novels in the same way, using nearly the same words, which suggests deliberate coordination that could not have been the result of mere shared sympathies. If Kessler, Gorn, Uris, and the novels The Anglo-Saxons and A Star in the Wind justified the Zionist conquest because it brings civilization into the backwards East and rescues the Arabs, and that Israeli colonization has a reforming mission, it would not surprise us to find the same words, almost verbatim, in a political book by Randolph Churchill concerning the aggression of June 5, 1967, serialized in the Sunday Telegraph between July-August 1967. This interconnection and, ultimately, convergence between the positions the Zionist novel had already injected into the chauvinistic Western mind, and the positions that mind ended up endorsing politically finds its clearest and most blatant manifestation in William Stevenson's The Israeli Victory, which was distributed within less than 10 days of the end of the 1967 aggression. The book's task was to provide a political and military report to the reader. It was also supplemented with a chapter by Leon Uris, whom we have already met and whose ideas in Exodus we have explored. Any reader will find that the military and political sections of the book amount to little more than a copy of, or a supplement to, the positions expressed in Exodus. Uris's chapter, titled The Third Temple, is simply an extension or reiteration of the positions that have already been entrenched by the aggression. The fact that the two pieces appear side by side sums up the point. Here is a series of interlocking episodes and overlapping tunnels in the same racist mind. Indeed, it is doubtful whether the tone of the paragons of Nazi racism, in what they wrote and said about the Jews in the 1930s, was more hateful, ignorant, or deceptive than Uris's tone in his new racist achievement in The Third Temple. What is astonishing is that a strong and well-developed current in the West finds it to be logical and acceptable, after gradually and uncritically swallowing such positions, ideas, and opinions over many years. The final outcome is the present-day Western position. Before all this, however, it was the same Nobel Prize Committee that offered its blessings to the Israeli message, as expressed by Shmuel Agnon. This message, as expressed in the works of this chauvinistic and reactionary Israeli writer, was a mere episode in the chain of events that led up to the aggression of 1967, and in what led to the acceptance of that aggression by a large portion of the Western audience. Exodus, Agnon, and the Third Temple represent a single conspiracy against the human mind. The Nobel Prize Committee, Worsthorne and Churchill, both father and son, merely echoed that process. In the previous chapters, we traced how Jewish chauvinism instrumentalized literature to serve its racist objectives along with the positions that it was compelled to adopt with remarkable coordination. Agnon occupied a prominent position in this long process of deception and justification of aggression, because the world's foremost cultural institution offered its blessings in what represented a crowning moment for Zionist literature's long journey, and a fabricated sanctification of its legitimacy. Awarding Agnon the Nobel Prize represented a fraudulent and illegitimate literary endorsement, to humanize what is fundamentally inhuman and to confer a civilizational value to what is reactionary. chauvinistic and racist. It amounts to a literary Balfour Declaration. In one respect, the Swedish Academy affirmed that it had awarded its prize to the Israeli writer for a number of reasons, among which was Agnon's precedence as the first Hebrew writer whose celebrity penetrated the barriers of language. But this, as most of Agnon's reviewers admit, is incorrect. Rather, they claim that the value of Agnon, as an author, stems from his ability to write in Hebrew at a time when one could not find Jewish literature that was not written in Eastern European Yiddish. In this respect, Agnon was not more than a Hebrew writer. Just a year before being awarded the prize, he was not known at all among the readers of other languages. Indeed, many Jews themselves regarded the process of stripping his work from its original language, i.e., translating it, to be tantamount to hollowing it out entirely. Only a single year beforehand, it was not possible to find more than 3 books by Agnon in English, published by that Zionist propaganda institution called Schocken in New York, at the end of the 1940s. And it seems that its distribution was so narrow that the publishing houses of London had to retranslate and redistribute it in May 1967. These stories were not written for a universal audience. They addressed the overzealous Jewish reader in religious terms. It is difficult for any other kind of reader to understand any of these stories or appreciate them. Indeed, one of his most famous short stories, which Jewish critics regard as the best of his writings, i.e., Forevermore, whose characters and places all start with the letters A and G, has yet to be deciphered by even those critics themselves. It may be that he was falling back on ancient religious legends, or that the 2 letters were nothing more than the first 2 of the writer's name, Agnon. The characters of almost all of his novels either speak or practice Jewish rituals and remember the heroes of the Old Testament. It is rare for God, a Jewish prophet or a dead person to be mentioned in any of his stories without being followed by the appropriate religious expression. If these phrases excite the feelings of the conservative Jewish reader, they elicit anything but breaking the barriers of language for non-Jewish readers. This is to say that a writer like Agnon, regardless of his provincial value, does not possess either a universal or humanistic dimension, which represent 2 key conditions for being awarded the Nobel Prize. And despite the fact that Agnon wrote little about his adopted homeland, what he did write about the topic is characterized by those 2 descriptions that Zionist literature never manages to escape: a call for expansionist conquest and contempt for other peoples. Agnon's main theme emphasized Jewish migration from Eastern Europe. This undoubtedly requires taking similar positions that can be found in other Zionist literature, which render non-integration with other peoples into a virtue. Of all Jewish writers, Agnon's foremost contribution for Zionism is that he found the most success in combining religious and political affairs. Underneath a loose-fitting religious garb stands his favorite character to announce, "May the day come when Jerusalem extends as far as Damascus, and in every direction." This sentence was not coincidental for a man who the Nobel Prize Committee regarded as having worked hard to present the cultural heritage of the Jewish people. If this is how the committee sees the matter, how can such a heritage consist of a humanistic message? Agnon repeats the message of conquest everywhere in his writings, without neglecting to dress it in religious attire. In his famous novel In the Heart of the Seas, he added Tyre and Sidon within the borders of the State of Israel that he hopes to see and which he justifies by repeating the alleged violation of the sanctity of Jewish religious sites there. This position plays the same role as discussions of Nazi massacres in other Zionist novels in that both serve as excuses for conquest, but this position, as we have seen in other Zionist novels, requires the depiction of Arabs as a hopelessly backward people, which allows them to represent the supposed Arab violation of sacred Jewish sites as a matter of course. This is why we find Agnon having to represent them in such a grotesque manner. His insistence on such contemptuous depictions of Arabs is necessary for him because it justifies why the Jews love the land of Israel deeply, which is being destroyed by the Arabs. It also explains why Jewish migration can be characterized as a humanitarian rescue mission. Otherwise, such crude and contemptuous imagery would not have been repeated in Zionist literature over the past 20 years. More conspicuous than Agnon's artistic transgressions is the fact that all of his Jewish characters in Tehillah have migrated from Eastern Europe to Jerusalem, and yet, they say that it was the Arabs who came to this land. This deliberate inversion of the facts, along with the conspicuous switching of roles it entails, would in other contexts be considered artistically, not to mention morally, unacceptable. Agnon provides another image that is worth examining. The fires were raging in Istanbul, and sometimes these fires would swallow 300 or 400 houses in one instance, or even more. But people would do nothing to stop the fire. All that was done was that the guards of the city would stop and scream, "There is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet." This scene is significant not only because of its deliberate distortion of the Islamic religion, but also because it pits the Muslims of Istanbul against a Jewish religious wisdom, which represents the premise of the novel, together with the claim of complete Jewish solidarity, as a religious duty. Despite the fact that Agnon returned to Poland and was shocked to witness the communal disintegration among the Jews there, he never ceased to emphasize the importance of migration. He regarded heading to Palestine as the ultimate resolution. Agnon's return to Poland in his youth was significant in his literary career because it instigated the shock that prompted a stylistic reorientation. His heroes once represented integrity, virtue, and enlightenment, with their worldly and spiritual purity culminating in migrating to Palestine. Then came a guest for the night to deal with a negative topic. Its heroes are deviant, lost, and living in vagabondage. The novel makes it clear, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this condition is the result of the destruction of Jewish traditions through war and wandering aimlessly. The heroes of this novel carry on aimlessly because their ancient traditions have been lost and have not been replaced by anything. Following A Guest for the Night came Agnon's latest novel Only Yesterday, which takes the latter idea further when the Zionist youth from Galicia, Isaac Kumar, migrates to Israel. The author explicitly commends Kumar, in his customary style of abruptly interrupting the narrative with direct dialogue. He regards the migration of this youth, who belongs to a middle-class family in Israel, as definitive proof of his integrity and honesty, at a time when the Jew, if he was Zionist and had some money, goes to a meeting, while he goes, if he had a lot of money, to Congress. The novel follows the news of Kumar during his migration, his life in Jaffa, Jerusalem, and the farming settlements until his early death as a result of a rabid dog's bite. The manner of Kumar's death can be understood as a metaphor for the hostile climate that surrounds Israel. More importantly, in writing this novel, Agnon artistically realized Ahad Ha'am's Zionist slogan of, "The last Jew and the first Hebrew." While the novel renders its hero Kumar as the focal point of the events throughout his migration, the focus suddenly changes upon his arrival to Israel to make him an observer of the events. He retreats from being the hero and an individual and becomes a member of society. The writing style also changes from strict realism to Agnon's traditional style, which mixes fiction and reality, and fiction, for Agnon, is made up of religious legends and what they symbolize. It is as if Agnon wants to tell his readers that arriving in Israel alone marks the end of the Jew, and the beginning of the Hebrew. In other words, it marks the end of the period of wandering, and the beginning of national renaissance, and finally putting Jewish traditions into action. Agnon's literary production is merely a call for migration, especially from Eastern Europe, to Palestine, and a call for conquest in the name of Jewish values and culture, in the words of the Nobel Prize Committee. His insistence on these two objectives led to artistic and ethical transgressions. He repeats the dangerous phenomenon of historical fabrication at the expense of human values. When a man engages in such a project, regardless of the efficacy of its fabrications, an international cultural institution with the stated objective of encouraging humanism does itself a disservice by lighting up a powder keg in a region whose catastrophe still weighs on the world's conscience. But the committee did more than that. It practically justified, legitimized and blessed Israeli aggression either deliberately or otherwise, and conferred a cultural honor upon the racist Jewish current. If the committee is not guilty of justifying the hideous racist attacks against Arabs in Europe and the United States that took place after the aggression of 1967, it is certainly guilty of another wrong. Its decision to award Agnon legitimizes the deception of humanity's collective conscience through incessant Zionist propaganda, the drumbeats of which have been reverberating worldwide for over half a century. Thanks for watching the Learner's Library. Please consider to like, subscribe and comment for more.